Thanks very much, Phil. Our conference finale, our wrap-up speaker, our guy who's going to make it all seem relevant and clear to us, is Hal Sawwasser. Hal gave me his resume, and I have to say it's quite an impressive resume. It would take me several minutes here to read it all. I'll give you just a couple highlights. You probably know Hal's worked for the Forest Service for the last decade, starting out as their regional ecologist, moving up to Deputy Director of the Fish and Wildlife Program in D.C. Most recently, he's been Director of the New Perspectives Program, and soon he is moving on to the University of Montana to become the Boone and Crockett Professor of Wildlife and Natural Resource Conservation. You probably know a lot of that stuff already, so what I did was I went out and did a little informal survey of Hal, though, among people at the conference. I asked them to provide me 3 adjectives to describe Hal, and I got some interesting responses. People had a hard time doing it in 3 adjectives. Somebody told me, more angles than a geometry book, fastest gums in the West. But actually, I'm just kidding. The adjectives that I got were almost uniformly the same, and that was creative, enthusiastic, and visionary. And visionary is one of the reasons we've asked him to provide a wrap-up and to try to summarize some of the conference and give some perspectives on what it all means. Hal Sawwasser.
I was anxious to hear some of those other adjectives. Fastest gums in the West, huh? That's a good one. Boy, this has been a remarkable experience for all of us. I have the task of saying a few things by nature of closing the conference, and this is a task that I've picked up a few times lately, and I'm not sure I like its implications. A friend of mine, Jack Thomas, also gets to do this periodically, and I was talking with him the other day about what it means when people start asking you to give closing remarks, and he said it means they think you're too far over the hill to have anything of value to say in the regular session, but they remember you fondly and they don't want you to feel left out. So I guess this is better than it could have been. I could still be sitting back in Washington, D.C., packing boxes, getting ready to come out here next week. One of the conference organizers said my task was to wrap everything up and deliver it in a way that inspires everybody to action. Now that's just not possible. It wasn't possible to hear everything that was said here. And it's the subject of this conference itself that is the inspiration to action, not all the charismatic mega words that have been littered around this conference during the last 3 days. So I'm going to give you just a few thoughts. I don't know whether the thoughts would be the same as that I would have a couple of weeks from now when there's a little bit more time to reflect upon what happened here, but this is kind of what I take away from the conference. Obviously, they're my thoughts. They might differ a little bit from how you would see the conference. They're obviously influenced by the environments that I have worked in and the cultural experiences that I had when I was growing up. The first thing, the overwhelming imprint that I leave this conference with is its uniqueness. As near as I can tell, this gathering was not stimulated by a new law or a new set of federal regulations or some new federal policy or even some lawsuit on the part of one faction of our society to impose its will on the rest. It doesn't appear to be dependent on a major new government program. There doesn't appear to be a big trough of federal dollars for all the hogs to slop in. It's not the result of a new academic view of a better world. It doesn't appear that science or pseudoscience was the stimulus for why you all came here. And I think all of those things make this a rather unique conference. We all came here voluntarily because we think that this watchable wildlife stuff is a lot of fun, that it's the right thing to do, that it's possibly a way to bring people together, people who may have some differences of opinion on certain aspects of wildlife conservation, but who are all willing to come together on a common purpose. This gathering and all the people who are still back at home who weren't able to come but have similar interests and commitments are pooling their talent and their willpower and their resources, their creativity, to do something together. And in this day of divisiveness and distortion and dishonesty on political as well as resource conservation matters, I think this makes the Watchable Wildlife movement something rather special to be a part of and to watch. I hope that you all will realize what you're building here and just how special it is. I think it could become one of the major alternatives to some of the wasteful and destructive confrontational approaches that have grown increasingly in the conservation movement during the past few decades. So I would urge us all to guard carefully what it is we're building here and not let it slide into some of the behaviors that characterize other aspects of wildlife conservation. I don't think that it would be a good idea to let any single government agency or any collection of government agencies take this thing over in the sense that they make it a policy or begin to pump so many dollars into it that everybody scrambles for those dollars and loses sight of what the magic that comes out of the fact that everybody is bringing what they have, what meager resources they have to the table to try to get more out of the collective whole of the resources. I happen to think it would not be a good idea to try to create a large trough of federal dollars that would, I think, take away some of the incentive for the creativity and the leveraging of talent and resources that's going on so far. Now, I don't mean to say it wouldn't be a good idea to have some federal dollars being contributed to the pot, because the people who work in agencies of the federal government need to have something to bring to the table, along with the private sector and the state people that are also participating in this. I've spent the last 6 years working in Washington, D.C., and I've seen what can happen when people use legislation, political action, and litigation to try to solve problems that ultimately are only solvable by people building a community of interest at regional and local levels. It not only doesn't work, it inhibits people from solving problems at local and regional levels. So I guess I would encourage you not to take the standard route of action. Don't go seeking new legislation. Don't try to get some federal agency to write a regulation. Don't try to get some federal agency to create a new policy. Continue building through the partnerships and the grassroots efforts that you're working with right now. This movement seems to be driven by positive incentives. Some of them are the personal incentives to do good. Some of them are economic incentives that people can actually make a living out of being involved in this effort. You're building coalitions of public and private sector groups, leveraging all your resources for a common cause. And I'm convinced that you can do more for the protection of natural resources, the conservation of the great richness of life that we use the term biological diversity these days to refer to. You can do more for that than can be accomplished by legislation, litigation, and some of the legal maneuverings that are going on in our society today. Now, I guess some of that might be a little bit of a harsh message to some people who participated in this conference, and could even make some people feel a little bit uncomfortable. And if it does, then I will have served my purpose. I think it's time to get uncomfortable with what we've let happen to the community of interest that once characterized the conservation movement in this country. It's time to pull together rather than letting divisive forces pull apart. It could be that the people working on Watchable Wildlife don't really want to accept this challenge of being the alternative to polarization, maybe not want to take on the enormous task of rebuilding the old partnerships, but it's something worth thinking about. You could be accidentally creating that alternative, and it could actually show people a way out of the mess that we have in Washington, D.C. and the Pacific Northwest, and probably a lot of other places that could pop up in the next few years, where people decide that conservation should be done through government coercion rather than through community action based on collective self-interest. So I just urge you to think about that as you go home and think about what it is you're building here. You may come to a different conclusion, and if you do, I'd sure like to know about it. So drop me a line at the School of Forestry here at the University of Montana if you have serious disagreements with what I've come up with as a perspective. I want to mention a couple of other thoughts that popped out of this meeting. And one of them is the term wildlife. I don't know how many of you know that about 50 to 60 years ago that was not one word, that was two words. And what wildlife meant at that time was not just what people have called the charismatic megafauna here. It meant all undomesticated living things. Plants, insects, fish, fungi, mosses, crustaceans, mollusks, probably worms, amphibians, reptiles. If you take a broad enough view, an American Indian view, it also means the rivers, the rocks, the mountains, and the soils, because once upon a time, those also were living things. All the molecules in them have passed through living entities over time. Well, this view of wildlife, I think, is what's going to emerge out of a movement like this. I think it's not too far down the road when a watchable wildlife program or a viewing guide includes the places that you can go see the butterfly migrations and the sensitive plant populations, and maybe even some special aquatic flora and fauna. It may not be too far down the road that we'll see a place where it features vernal pools, and you got to put a little some kind of a periscope or something down into the water to see the ostracods and the cladocerans and all swimming around down there, and realize that there's a phenomenal world of life even in these springtime ponds. We know this term today, this term wildlife, the way it was originally used by the term biological diversity. And it's obvious from the discussions here that this wildlife that we're concerned about is certainly more than something to shoot with a camera or a weapon, to ponder in awe. It's certainly more than a source of civic pride or economic gain. It's all those things, but it's a lot more. Those of you that were fortunate to sit in on one of the sessions this morning that Patrick Lefthand and Lewis Adams from the Confederated Tribes of the Flathead Reservation gave, it would be clear to you that this wildlife that we're talking about is a constant reminder of our relationships with all of creation. It's obviously integral parts of the very sources of our own well-being, and it's something that keeps us in touch with the need to realize and remember our role as stewards of the legacy of life that surrounds us. So the word connections comes to mind in this watchable wildlife. Now, the word watchable obviously tells you one connection, it's sight. You're seeing things. But I think there's a lot more ways that we're connected with this stuff. We hear it. Sometimes we feel it. Sometimes we taste it. Sometimes we smell it, as we saw at the luncheon the other day. We connect with it through thought, creativity. Those are the ways we connect with it. And those kind of translate into spiritual connections, recreational connections, subsistence connections, economic well-being connections, and obviously, as you've seen with the booths and the poster, through arts and crafts, and many, many different cultural connections. These are the ways that we relate to this wild life, not just the watchable, not just by seeing it. I want to read you a comment that I saw in a book not too long ago. It's a comment about, I think, about the subject of this conference, and it's from the autobiography of a man named Tatanga Mani. He was a Stony Indian. He lived from the late 1800s to in 1967. This is from his autobiography. Oh yes, I went to the white man's schools. I learned to read from school books, newspapers, and the Bible. But in time I found that these were not enough. Civilized people depend too much on man-made printed pages. I turned to the Great Spirit's book, which is the whole of his creation. You can read a big part of that book if you study nature. You know, if you take all your books, lay them out under the sun, let the snow and rain and insects work on them for a while, there will be nothing left. But the Great Spirit has provided for you and me with an opportunity for study in nature's university. The forests, the rivers, the mountains, and the animals which include us. That's a good expression of what these connections are all about. I got just a couple other comments. There was a lot of discussion about goals. What were we doing this all for? I think it'll take some time for you to all focus in on a common set of goals, but let me just mention a few that appeared to come out of the discussions. I don't know if they're in any particular order. Obviously, one of them is to increase awareness about nature. That largely occurs through the experience of engaging this wildlife. Another is to build understandings about how ecological systems, about how nature works, why all the parts are important. That is certainly enhanced by the interpretation part of this program. Another is to gain commitment and support for conservation and stewardship as ways of life. Now, that's kind of the buy-in, when you make that connection and decide this is worth putting some of your energy into. I also heard some discussion about the purpose of instilling a sense of community among people and between people, land, and resources. And I was reminded of a Navajo concept that the term they use is hojo, and it means harmony and balance. And some of you may be familiar with the Navajo Blessing Way, which talks about beauty before me I walk, beauty behind me I walk. In all beauty, life is everlasting. I think this balance and harmony has a lot to do with what we're trying to achieve here, people gaining an appreciation for their role in nature. I also sense that there's a strong commitment among many people here to rebuild that common ground of people for conservation and resource stewardship, to turn the tide on some of the stridency that has popped up in our midst, so that we offer the public, the people of this nation, a viable alternative between the no resource use under any circumstance versus no temperance at all in the use of resources. Obviously, one of the goals on some people's part is to make some money. One of the goals on a lot of people's part is to have some fun. It appears also from some of the joy last night that there's a goal here to celebrate our successes and to share information on what works. And here I'm reminded of a phrase that was used down in the Southwest this last year to characterize a centennial of the conservation movement. And the phrase, and pardon my Spanish here because I don't know how to pronounce very well, but it was something along the lines of celebrate la tierra y la gente, celebrate the land and the people. I like that phrase. I think that characterizes some of the sense of celebration that's going on in this movement. Let me finish with a stab at 6 principles for success. These things could probably be ordered in any number of ways. These are things that I heard people talking about here, and I think they probably are the beginnings of some pretty good take-home stuff. Now I've ordered them kind of in an order that I would put them in, but you all may have a different way of doing this too. First one I've got is the basis for all aspects of a watchable wildlife program is respect for all life, protection of basic resources, and by that I mean soils and water and air and flora and fauna, and ethical behavior regarding our relationships with land and resources. That ethical behavior is whether you have a bow and arrow in your hands, or a rifle, or a camera, or a pair of binoculars. A second principle appears to be the need for some sense of where you're going. A strategic plan was mentioned, although there was some concern about getting too much into planning. But certainly the Watchable Wildlife Program must fit as part of a larger set of things that are aiming at conservation goals, stewardship goals. I like to think of the metaphor of somebody taking a bow and arrow and shooting an arrow into the side of a barn and then running up and drawing concentric circles around it and yelling bullseye. Now, that I don't think is what we want to do here. I think we want to have a sense of where those circles are so that we know where we're aiming with these programs, and that we know what part a Watchable Wildlife Program plays, what part elementary education plays, and so forth. So some sense of a plan. I think Watchable Wildlife may be just a tool. Obviously, the viewing guides are a tool. Maybe the Watchable Wildlife is the hook that we use to get people to reconnect with the land and to their understanding of the role of stewardship. Third principle is, and I think I see this happening here, and I'm really pleased to see it, don't try to build your program by tearing others down. It is not necessary for this program to be anti-anything. It's not anti-hunting, it's not anti-trapping, it's not anti-resource use. This is a positive program. This is something that you're all for, not a reflection of something that you're against. I think it's entirely likely that the success of this program will have some changes, will affect some changes on how certain things are being done. It certainly could affect the way people use other resources and the timing of when they do those things. But build on the positives. A fourth one is that certainly this is all about relationships and partnerships. Building a community of owners in the program, turning potential antagonists into partners. I think that you all should be more than a little pleased to see organizations like the Boone and Crockett Club, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, the State Fish and Wildlife Departments here side by side with the National Audubon Society, the Defenders of Wildlife, Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. There is a common interest here. We have differences on some things, but we have a common interest. Restoring positive relationships, building a partnership for this is an absolutely critical principle. The fifth one I've got down is taking an ecosystems approach. A lot of people talk about ecosystems. Absolutely is essential that we move in that direction, but I urge you not to forget that the species, the parts of those systems are still important. You don't take an ecosystems approach by starting to ignore the parts. We have to pay attention to certain species. We certainly have to pay attention to the processes that make these systems run. And success in the long run will only occur if we realize that people are part of all these ecosystems. I think that one keys into why an interdisciplinary approach, bringing biological and social sciences together, bringing sciences and philosophy together, the sciences and the humanities, is very important, and I certainly see that happening here. The last principle is kind of a collection of things, I guess, and I put it under the banner of incentives and marketing as a way of doing business. This is all about having a high-quality product and bringing that product and customers together in ways that enrich both the product, which is the wildlife and the habitats, and the experience of the customers, getting top value out of that experience. You're doing it through incentive approaches. That's absolutely important. You're doing it through economic and technical assistance to landowners. By increasing the value of the product. You know, if you think of our traditional view of wildlife, big game, which it used to be, it had value to most people for only a couple of months out of the year when it was hunted. And then people said, well, wait a minute, wildlife's more than that. So we had more things than just the game animals that all of a sudden had value. Now we're saying, wait a minute, there's values in this stuff for viewing it in certain times of the year, for studying it and understanding that it's got value in its translation into arts and crafts. So there's a value-added aspect going on here that's, in a marketing concept, says we're getting a lot more worth out of this basic resource than we ever did before. And that means interpretation is an absolutely critical tool of management. Interpretation is not something you do if you have a little money left over at the end of the year. You don't move forward on a program that stresses multiple values to people without interpretation being a key aspect. And I will conclude with another comment from a Native American, this one from the dying words of a man named Crowfoot from Alberta, what is now Alberta, in the late 1800s. What is life? It is the flash of a firefly in the night. It is the breath of a buffalo in the wintertime. It is the little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset. Have a good trip home, and look forward to seeing you next year.